What is up, Gamer Army? Welcome back once again to another episode of Psycho Gamer. I'm your host, Aubrey, and today we are not going to talk about arcades or arcade one-up like I normally do, but we are going to talk about some retro gaming. What kind of retro game? We're going to talk about some of the different consoles that are out there that a lot of people really are digging, I guess you could say, in terms of collecting. Which ones do you guys have? Are any of the consoles I'm going to talk about going to be in your list of retro gaming consoles? Stay tuned. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe, and we're going to talk about retro gaming right after this. All right, welcome back once again, guys. Like I said, today we are going to talk about retro gaming. Now, this video may be a little long because there are a lot of really old consoles that are out there that many of you may or may not even know. Maybe some of you are new to gaming. Maybe some of you are brand new to retro gaming. So this is going to be for those of you that know about the games, those of you that don't know about the games. We're not necessarily going to go hardcore into the games for these consoles, but we are going to touch on them just a little bit, especially some of the ones that are actually out there. So what is pretty much the first one we're going to talk about? Well, it's definitely going to have to be Pong. Now, why Pong? Well, Pong was really the first video game that didn't just have an arcade release, but also had a home release. There were so many different variations of Pong by itself. It didn't sell a great amount, but you're looking at 150,000 consoles that were actually sold, plain and simple. But that wasn't the only one that was released. Did you know that in the first generation of video game consoles, there were over 900 different variations of Pong, not just in the US, but Japan and across the world. You had Telstar, Nintendo had their color TV game series, so like the little small handhelds, they had a lot of those, really good guys too. Magnavox, if many of you do not recognize the name Magnavox, they actually had their Odyssey lineup, which was a really unique kind of console. They had a couple different variations of it. If you remember, many of those consoles back in those days, they all had like these controllers with maybe like a joystick that actually had a little spinner on the top of it. They had a whole bunch of buttons. It looked like a phone is really what a lot of these controllers really looked like. Were they fun to play? Well, back then for a lot of people, that's all there was. That's all you had available to actually play. So a lot of people didn't quite get into gaming like they thought they were going to, especially when it comes to how they could go to an arcade, plunk some quarters down, and play with their friends. But in terms of home consoles, you can sit down with your friends and you can just play. You can drink beer. You can do pretty much anything that you want to do. Now, first generation, obviously you had Coleco. They had their Telstar. And that was really it, other than the 9 billion variations of Pong that were actually out there. Now, the second generation of game consoles you're looking at, you had your Atari 2600s, you had your ColecoVisions, you had your Intellivisions, and you also had the Odyssey 2 by Magnavox. Now, most of these were very similar to each other in terms of how they actually worked with the controls. So they all had either these crazy little controllers, or much like the Magnavox Odyssey, it looked like a typewriter. As big as it was, I have a Magnavox Odyssey too, so that thing is gigantic. So if you haven't seen it, I'm going to post some pictures here, probably right up above me, so that you have a much better idea of what this console is going to look like. It is a massive console. If you thought the Xbox was big, this thing makes the Xbox consoles look small in comparison. So Magnavox Odyssey 2 was just a massive, gigantic console. Now, the Atari 2600, which went into the 5200 and then the 7200s back in that time, they are great retro gaming consoles because they were so unique. The Atari joystick by itself was probably the most unique looking one that you could get on any console. So it made it much more appealing to a lot of people in the fact that you can get these cartridges, much like you could on all these other consoles that were out there, like ColecoVision and Television. But Atari had a much larger backing over these other consoles. You had over 30 million 2600 go out, and that is huge by comparison to the ColecoVisions and the Odysseys and the Intellivisions, where they didn't even come close to matching the Atari 2600. I mean, you only had 2-3 million of each of those consoles go out, as opposed to 30 million Atari 2600s. So, at the end of the day, it was a great investment. Now, their last console, the 7800, I guess you can consider that the third generation of game consoles, did horrible. Only had 1 million consoles come out. Why? Well, they were up against Nintendo and Sega. You know, you had the Sega Master System. You had the Nintendo Entertainment System, the NES. The old school, blow in the cartridge, put it in, and shake, 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 and keep hitting reset until your game eventually started. And hopefully, it didn't go on the blink in the middle of a game, because that really stunk. You know, I played many, many hours of Legend of Zelda, only to have it mess up. Yeah, not fun. Imagine playing Minecraft, and it doesn't have autosave, and your game crashes 6 hours into building a level. Best level you've ever made. Gone in a blink of an eye. Urgh. Very frustrating. Sega Master System for Sega console. So, how many of you guys have had some of these consoles that I've been talking about? You know, there are many other consoles that were out there, but these are just some of the ones that a lot of people were really into. Now, after this, you had the Super Nintendo that came out, CDI, you had the Sega Genesis, and the TurboGrafx 16. Now, between the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, it was a battle to the death. You know, you had Sonic and you had Mario. Two of the biggest game characters that you could find in this era and generation of game consoles. So people were always wondering, well, who would win in a fight, Mario or Sonic? Well, you weren't going to find out until many, many years later when Sega stopped actually making consoles. So TurboGrafx 16 had Bonk. Bonk's Adventure. Big little caveman that just beat the snot out of everything with his head. Bonk was awesome. I remember going, this is another story, I know, but I remember going into Radio Shacks and seeing Bonk's Adventure playing on some of these consoles. It was TurboGrafx 16 or I think it might have been the CDI. It's hard to remember in this case. But, you know, up until the end of this generation, Sony was already in talks with Nintendo to make a collaboration console for the Super Nintendo. So it was supposed to be the Nintendo PlayStation. Well, things broke down. As many of you have seen on TV and online, somebody actually found one of these retro gaming pieces of history that was supposed to attach to the Nintendo by Sony. So I think he ended up selling it not too long ago. I think it went for like $100,000 or $200,000 or something like that. It was some insane amount of money. Realistically, it probably would have made my heart a little better to have somebody bought it and put it into a museum so people could actually take a look at it. But the fact that he was able to find it, because I think it was his dad or grandfather had actually worked on the console, is still really cool that they ended up finding this piece of history instead of it going to the dump somewhere and being destroyed and smashed. Next generation had PlayStation. Sony basically had the big FU to Nintendo, and they released their own console, and That took the wind out of Nintendo's sail. Big time. Sega had their Sega Saturn, Nintendo 64, you had the PCFX, and realistically, I haven't even touched on any of the handhelds like the Game Boy or the Game Gear or the Sega Nomad, if you're not familiar with those particular consoles, or even the Atari Lynx. So the Atari Lynx was a cool little handheld, but it just sucked batteries like no tomorrow. And you really had to have like 6 AA batteries to last it like 2 hours maybe at the most. But it was one of the first handheld game consoles, or first handheld systems that you could really get that actually had that. The Game Boy was just the green and black look, but you had games like Super Mario Land and things like that that really had the backing of Nintendo until Pokemon came out. Pokemon really brought a lot of life back to Nintendo, especially with their handheld systems. So I think that's going to do it for now, guys. It's a lot of information to take in right now. Hopefully you guys like the content. If you guys have some of these consoles, post it down below. Tell me which one of these consoles are your favorite classic gaming consoles. How many consoles do you guys have? I, at one point, had over 40 different gaming consoles. I moved, and unfortunately, I had to sell a lot of them because I had no room to take them with me. Moving cross-country in a Ford Mustang with almost all of your worldly possessions, there's not enough room for 40 game consoles, unfortunately, to go with you. I only have maybe about 10 or 15 now, as most of them are back behind me, and a couple are in closets, such as my Odyssey 2. There's no room to put it out here. So, but hopefully you guys like the content. Make sure you hit that like and subscribe. Tell me some of your favorite classic gaming console stories. Maybe how you got your first game console. Was it a gift? What was your best console that you remember buying? I know the first game console I went out of my way and actually bought was the Sega Dreamcast. We're going to talk about that in the next video, though, guys. So hit that like and subscribe, like I mentioned. Turn on post notifications. And stay tuned for part 2 of the retro gaming consoles. Game on.